If you're booking tickets, you're making a reservation, you're calling someone to complain about service, you wouldn't be at all surprised to be asked to give your name. You certainly wouldn't dread giving your name. Not so those who have to answer the name's Bond. James Bond. Those who share a name with 007 can feel cursed rather than blessed, something only others called James Bond can really understand. A new documentary tells their stories and brings them together. I've been speaking to James Neil Bond, a retired preacher from Texas, who goes by that added extra name because he comes from a family of James Bonds. And I've been talking to the filmmaker who found him, Matt Bauer. I asked him why he'd made his documentary, The Other Fellow.
I was curious what it would be like to sort of live as a man in the shadow of kind of the most famous fictional man in the world, but also everything that comes with being James Bond. The most famous sort of alpha male of the 20th century, and what kind of pressure that puts on a man. But also as a filmmaker, I found it quite like a fascinating, almost sort of sci-fi horror conceit that these guys are kind of haunted every day by this fictional character, but also by kind of a media franchise that kind of haunts them.
Is haunted the right word, Matt?
I think it kind of is the right word, because I think it is almost, when you're kind of haunted, or in film when someone is sort of haunted by like a ghost or a, poltergeist or something. And for these guys, it is this incredibly massive film franchise that goes on forever and will continue.
Well, James Bond in Texas, has your life been haunted by this fictional character?
Indeed, it has. It's been both a blessing and a curse. Mainly, it's when you meet somebody for the first time and you soon realize they're not interested in you. They're interested in James Bond from the movies.
When your parents called you James, did they have any idea what they were doing?
No, sir, they didn't. The first Ing Fleming novel came out in 1952. I was born in 1953. So I was kind of ahead of the game.
And when did you first realise that this would be a problem?
Well, actually, it all started when I was in junior high. That was when the first James Bond movie hit our little small West Texas oil field town. So I got called 00 by everybody.
So, and I'm sure people tell you you're shaken, not stirred and all the rest of it, but you said occasionally it had been a blessing. In what way?
Well, when you're in a service industry, having the name James Bond can sometimes mean some additional gratuities. I used to drive a shuttle bus, and up on the visor of the shuttle was a sign that said, "Your driver is none other than Bond. James Bond."
Some people didn't enjoy being called James Bond nearly as much as our James from Texas, Matt. Tell us some stories that you learned.
Well, definitely the one who found it the hardest, funnily enough, was our James Bond, who lived in London, who turned out to also be quite kind of tall, dark and handsome. And weirdly, he found it the hardest of anybody. And also on the haunting thing, James Bond is obviously bigger in London than anywhere else in the world. It's kind of the epicenter of James Bond, but it also means that everyone else around you is armed with far more references and jokes and that kind of thing. And you can imagine kind of going to school in London with your name James Bond. It's incredibly difficult. He actually changed his name from James Bond when he was 32 years old. He couldn't really handle it anymore. So he actually took on his partner's name, and he's been a lot happier.
Finally, Matt, when you got all these James Bonds together for the movie, it sounds like it might have been a therapy session.
It was in some ways. What I kind of learned from is like any kind of problem, especially when your name is James Bond, it's incredibly isolating, and it may sound like a joke, but it is this kind of bizarre psychological situation you're put into. And at least for my Bonds here in Texas, where they're all called James Bond, they had each other. But for the others in my film, most of them had never met another James Bond. Now they're all kind of friends on social media and they talk to each other. One of them kind of said in his last interview that, doing this film had been like a therapy for him. when he has one of these problems and has a bizarre encounter with someone that day, at least he's got someone to talk to about it who understands.
Matt Bauer, director of The Other Fellow. James Neil Bond, shaken but not stirred from Texas. Thank you very much for joining us.